Do you feel slow on F124? Does the car feel clunky? Do you struggle with understeer, oversteer, or simply can't find the right balance between the two? Well, if you said yes to any of these things, or just want to get faster on F124, then this video is for you. Car setup is arguably the most vital aspect to driving in sim racing, as a good car setup can easily help you shave seconds off your lap time. In this video, I'm going to cover the basics of the car setup in F124, and review what each of these categories do to your car's handling. Once we're done with that, I'll go over a good baseline setup for every track, as well as the best ways to tweak your setup to fix any handling problems you have over the course of a lap. After watching this video, you should be able to create your own setups and have a good understanding of how to tweak the car and extract that extra level of performance. First, why is car setup important? Why not just use the default setups? When I first started playing the F1 games, I just didn't understand how crucial car setup really is. When using the default setups, you're limiting the customization of the car's feeling through the corners, traction out of corners, straight line speed, stiffness, and a million other things. Default setups just give you a basic, general setup for the track. When selecting one of the setups from low downforce to high downforce, you cater it to the track. For example, in Monza, you select the low downforce setup, and in Monaco, you select the high downforce setup. The main differences here are the amount of downforce and the suspension geometry, but even these are still too general to really allow you to extract the full performance of the car. Not to mention, everyone's driving style is a little bit different, so a default setup that works for me might be completely terrible for you, and vice versa. However, if we both use custom setups, we would both be able to prioritize certain elements in order to suit our own driving styles. So first we have aerodynamics. This is usually the first thing people start to play around with. To put it simply, aerodynamics change the amount of downforce or drag on the front or rear wings. If you're at a circuit like Monza, you want low wings, Monaco, you want high wings, and at a balanced track like Bahrain, you want balanced wings. Obviously, the more you add to the front and rear wing means you'll have more responsiveness and downforce through the corners, but you'll be much slower on the straights. It's important to balance the front and rear wing to achieve a balance of these two elements, good cornering speed and the least amount of drag possible for the straights. This is probably the most straightforward element of customizing your setup. For F124, I'm noticing that the best setups usually have more front wing than rear wing in terms of aerodynamics, but not too much of a gap. So far this game, the rear end seems to be planted when going through corners, so there's less of a need to have higher rear downforce. Adding front downforce helps with turn-in responsiveness and rotation through corners. This is the easiest part of the setup, as feeling the difference when adding and subtracting downforce is quite obvious. There are now 3 categories to customize for transmission settings on F124. The first is the differential on throttle, then the differential off throttle, and finally engine braking. Differential on throttle is the way the power is transmitted through the wheels. A lower input here means that the differential is more unlocked, allowing the wheels to travel at different speeds, and a higher input here means that the differential is more locked, making the wheels travel at the same speed. An unlocked differential sacrifices immediate traction out of corners for a more balanced traction while in the corner, and locked differential does the opposite. So far in F124, most setups prefer a lower differential, but this is up to preference. For me, I prefer something around 40% on most tracks, so leaning more towards the unlocked but still towards the middle. Since the rear end is more planted on F124, you can definitely get away with a higher on-throttle differential. The next category is differential off-throttle, which now goes hand in hand with the new engine braking setting. More engine braking means your car slows down faster and charges more battery under braking, but is more oversteering. Less engine braking means the car doesn't slow down as fast and you have less battery charge when braking, but the car is more stable. If you run high engine braking, it's better to run a higher off-throttle differential. These balance each other out, so if you run lower engine braking, it's better to run lower off-throttle differential. Personally, I prefer to run higher engine braking since I prefer an oversteery car anyway, so therefore I run a higher off-throttle diff as well. If you prefer a more stable car, you can lower both of these settings to find the right balance for you. Personally, I think the advantages to running higher engine braking setting outweigh the negatives, as you can always balance the oversteer with suspension geometry. Camber is the first setting on this tab, and adjusting camber means you give yourself either more or less tire contact with the track itself. In last year's game, front and rear camber were generally always maxed out to the right, however in this year's game it's a different story. At this point, it seems that the setups that run camber all the way to the left seem better, as grip is more important than traction in F124. Now, the toe defines how much the wheels are pointed straight versus how much the wheels are pointed inward. This affects turn-in responsiveness when entering a corner, so a large value is more responsiveness at a cost of stability, and vice versa with a lower value. In my opinion, this is a little less important than camber in this year's game. Since the front end already feels almost overly responsive, I like to leave these generally towards the middle to be more balanced. Suspension is quite an important part of the setup, but it can also be the most confusing. The first thing to adjust here is the stiffness of the front and rear suspension. Stiffer springs make the car drive a bit harsher over bumps and curbs, and also harsher on the tires. On the other hand, softer springs can ride easier on the curbs and are less strenuous on the tires, but aggressive braking and acceleration can overload the springs and cause issues with stability. These values change from game to game, and for F124 it seems like a stiff front suspension and a soft rear suspension is favorable for most tracks. This allows you to have maximum top speed as the springs compress in the rear, but also allows you to have stability when braking or accelerating. Next is the front and rear anti-roll bars, which affect the body roll and weight transfer of the car through corners, as well as the load on the tires. Stiff anti-roll bars are better for initial responsiveness, whereas soft anti-roll bars are better for overall traction. Again, in F124, it seems like stiffer anti-roll bars are better for overall pace, as traction is already abundant for most car setups. Lastly, we have ride height, which is also new to F124. This year's values for front ride height go from 0 to 40, and rear goes from 40 to 100. So it's impossible to have front ride height higher than rear height. Lower ride height gives you more straight line speed, however there's more of a risk of bottoming out on curbs and bumps, and higher ride height does the opposite. Higher ride height is also worse for cornering, so I generally prefer a ride height on the lower end of things. In F124, I think a range of 15 to 25 for front height and a range of 50 to 65 for rear height is sufficient for most tracks. Again, too low will bottom you out on the curbs, so I think this is probably the bare minimum you need. This category is pretty straightforward. The brake pressure is from 0 to 100%, 100% being full power under braking. Now, you'd think this is always going to be at 100%, but I like to lower it on tracks that have tricky corners that might be easy to lock up at. If I'm at a track where I know I might lock the wheels under braking here and there, I'll take a percent or two off the brake pressure. This way the car isn't braking at full potential, and it alleviates a bit of that pressure if I'm about to lock up. Next is brake bias, which is the split of balance between the front and the rear brakes. In past F1 games, 58% was pretty standard in a lot of setups, but this year I'm finding that's not the case at all. I've been using 56 or 55% for most tracks, and I find that it's a good balance to have. If you set this too far forward, like around 60%, you'll lock up everywhere, and if you set it too far to the rear wheels, you can spin under braking. 56% seems to be the best so far. Tires are overlooked, but definitely important. The lower the tire pressure, the more outright traction you have, and the higher tire pressure, the more responsiveness and straight line speed you have. Again, traction isn't much of an issue in this game, so I find that higher tire pressures are a bit better. It's better to have higher tire pressures on the front tires compared to the rear, somewhere in the range of 23 to 26 for the front two tires and 20 to 23 for the rear. Okay, so now that we've gone over each element of the setup, let's review and make a baseline setup that's good for most tracks. For balanced aerodynamics, we should do 36 on the front and 32 on the rear. For differential, we should do 50%, 70%, and 100%. For suspension geometry, we want negative 3.5, negative 2.5, 0.25, and 0.25. For suspension, we want 35 and 1 for stiffness, 18 and 13 for anti-roll bars, and 20 and 55 for ride height. For brakes, we want 99% brake pressure and 55% brake bias. Lastly, for tires, we want 25 on the fronts and 22 on the rears. This should be a good baseline setup to start with that applies for most balanced tracks. Obviously, for outliers like Monza and Monaco, your changes to this setup will be a bit more drastic. However, for tracks like Bahrain, Spain, Canada, etc., this should be a good place to start. So, you've gone into FP1 or time trials, loaded up this setup, and you're noticing some issues. Let's go over how to fix that. If you feel the car is too oversteery, meaning the rear end feels loose and is kicking out mid-corner, feels unstable under braking, or it's hard to put the power down on corner exit, here are some changes you can consider. You may want to slightly increase the aero on your rear, you can lower the angle of toe, and lastly, you can play with the front and rear anti-roll bars. If you feel the car is too understeery, you can do the opposite of this, decreasing rear aero, raising the angle of toe, and again, messing around with the front and rear anti-roll bars. This goes for every aspect of the car. If you have too much drag on the straight and are slower than the cars around you, decrease your aero and try to make up for that loss of downforce with other elements of the setup. If you fly down the straights but are slow or unstable through corners, increase the aero on your setup. For every action or feeling of the car, there's an exact correlation with the setup. To learn car setups better, start with a few laps on the default setup, then change to the one I recommended earlier and do a few laps with that, and then spend the next few laps tweaking little things here and there to increase performance or to suit your own style of driving. The more you do this for each track, the more you'll understand car setups. So that's going to do it for this one. If you learned anything or this video helped you out, feel free to like, subscribe, leave a comment below, or join my Discord, which is linked in the description. So if you made it this far, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.